3 to 4 discussion opportunities for us here. This has been a kind of rapid project. We decided, I think, to do this about 2 weeks ago. And we really are interested in having launching and having an ongoing discussion about this topic of transparency and material health, and really focusing on the practice implications of that. So thank you very much for braving the first discussion here in this series, and thank you for joining us on the live stream. Welcome. We understand there are a lot of you on the live stream, so thank you very much for being with us. I thought I'd introduce you to our panel today, our friends in this field and also our friends in the audience here. The next one? Sorry. Yes. Next slide. Thank you. I'm going to go from your right to left. So introducing Amanda Kaminsky, who's here in the orange. Amanda Kaminsky is the founder and principal of Building Product Ecosystem, a longtime collaborator of ours. BPE operates multidisciplinary collaboratives that evolve feedstocks, recycling, infrastructure, and logistics for optimal systemic health and performance of major building materials on behalf of building owners and their supply chains and recycling networks. It's a big job that Amanda has. She carefully pilots improvements on projects under active development with building owners, manufacturers, recyclers, contractors, designers, engineers, regional policymakers, and academic researchers. She has probably the biggest job of any of us. Next to her is Wendy Vittori, partner in crime. She is the executive director of the Health Product Declaration Collaborative, a not-for-profit member organization committed to transparency, openness, and innovation in building products. Prior to assuming this position in May 2015, Wendy has served as a leader in business, academic, and civic contributions for over 30 years. She began her career as a software engineer, where she led technology businesses at both Intel and Motorola. Next to Wendy is John Amatruda, who's is a principal and leader at the at Vidaris in their Green Services Department. He specializes in environmentally conscious design and the evaluation of green materials and systems. He's worked as a consultant on over 90 LEED projects nationwide and internationally, using all variations of the LEED commercial program, and was named a LEED Fellow in 2013. And finally, and importantly, there's Robin Gunther on the end there, a leader in this field for many years. Robin is a principal at Perkins & Will and senior advisor to Healthcare Without Harm. Her innovative healthcare projects have been published nationally and internationally. Robin works at the intersection of healthcare, architecture, and sustainability policy, and participates in a wide range of advocacy initiatives while continuing to work in practice. And my name is Alison Mears. I'm an architect, assistant professor of architecture, and director, as I said, of the Healthy Materials Lab at Parsons. I'm co-principal investigator of the Healthy Affordable Materials Project, partners with Wendy Vittori and HPDC on this. The project is a coalition of 4 organizations who work together to incorporate human health as a criteria for evaluating building products to improve the interior environments of affordable housing. I'm going to give it over now to Wendy, who is going to give an introduction to this particular series and talk about why we thought this is an important time in our history to be launching this initiative and what we hope to get out of it, I guess. Yeah, welcome.
Thank you very much, Alison. And, we're all very delighted to be here today. And again, thanks to those who are on the live stream. This is the first, as Alison said, of a series that we're pulling together to specifically address the issues that practicing architecture and design firms face when they try to introduce the practices of transparency about product contents, health information, and then use that information in the decision-making in actual live projects. We call that part material health. And so, you know, we have been working, many of us in this room, many of us who are not here right now. I think Robin actually we're really thrilled that you could be here today, Robin, because I think you're one of the ones who has really been, had the foresight, you know, many, many years ago to envision that this needed attention. The wellspring of all of this is often dated back to Rachel Carson with The Silent Spring, which is now over 50 years ago that this was published, pointing to the problem with persistent toxins and environmental and human health effects as a result of those. And certainly since that time, what we know is that there's been a rapid growth in the introduction of many, many, many new chemicals. And the bottom line, if this is a field that is new to you, is that at this time, at least here in the United States, there's very, very little governmental involvement with the testing or regulation of how these chemicals appear in products. Our specific focus here is how they appear in products that we use to construct our buildings, that we use to furnish our buildings, that we use for the finishes of these buildings. And so what we represent is a collective effort that is far larger than the group convened here, but we're good representatives of it. It's probably, you know, somewhere several hundred people from the architecture design world as well as from the product manufacturing world who have become very active, working together as a community of practice to introduce this information into the normal day-to-day workings of an architecture design firm, of a building owner, of a construction firm, so that the end result can be selecting products that use less of chemicals of concern by selecting products to build with that have safer and better materials in them. Now, this is a long journey that we're all involved in here. And where we're at right now is a really, really critical turning point, we believe. You've heard that term tipping point or inflection point. We think we're sort of approaching that, maybe at that. And what that is the point in time where we're going to start to have enough information about enough products that's accurate enough that an architect or designer could actually really think about starting to use this information for product selection and specification. It's been a long buildup, you know, between 5 and 10 years of effort, believe it or not, to get to the point where we have these resources now in place. And we have tremendous cooperation, believe it or not, from the manufacturing community, where we have hundreds of manufacturers who are voluntarily making public this information. Our particular initiative at the HPD Collaborative involves collecting this information and publishing it so that anyone in the public could have access to it. And we have over 4,100 of these reports published today that represent somewhere between 10 and 20,000 actual building products that you might be encountering. In fact, many of the ones you do encounter in your day-to-day work. So I don't want to dwell on the introduction here, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of background. At the end, we're going to talk about some resources that are available to you to follow up, and we hope that you will do so. But let me now turn to the first topic that we have. So the format for tonight's discussion series is going to be a discussion where we have some kickoff questions that our different panelists will respond to, and then we can discuss those. And then we'll have an opportunity before we leave that topic to have some feedback from the audience if you have questions or want to participate. So we have 3 topics that we want to address. Each one's going to be about 15 minutes in length. And so we'll try and get through the sort of prepared topics that we think will be of interest, we hope will be of interest to you as the audience, and in the first 10 minutes or so, and then open it up to the audience for any interactive discussion. At the end, we'll have some closing comments, and I think, did we cover everything about the? Oh, did we have that? How does that work on the live stream, Abby? You have the opportunity to ask questions on the live stream, and so what we'll do during the closing comments is we'll take some of those questions from the people on the live stream. So I think with that, let us get started. So the first topic that we're going to talk to is this issue of how a firm might reach a decision to introduce transparency and material health practices into their projects. We know that there are many of you who are individual champions, and you're doing what you can on projects when you can, but this is really about how do we get a commitment from the firm itself to say, going forward, in some way, shape, or form, we as a firm are going to be doing something. So I'd like to ask Robin, perhaps you could address the first question. Thinking about senior management support, when we hear about change initiatives, no matter if it's this or anything else, one of the things that's often said is how critical senior management support is. Could you talk about that a little bit from your own experience?
Sure, Wendy. First of all, I started working on material health when I had a small firm. And so I was both a firm owner and somebody who sat at a desk and made material selections and decisions about materials. So I was sort of wearing both hats. And so often it really does start from people sitting at their desk trying to make better decisions about materials. And then if you happen to be in middle management or senior management in a firm, then you can take that up the pathway. Perkins & Will is sort of a different story. I joined Perkins & Will about 11 years ago, and they were really interested at a senior management level in this topic. This topic was barely emergent at that time, but the CEO and the leadership of the firm, I think, who really, it's their job to sort of see what's on the horizon, saw it as a topic that they thought would grow and gain more importance. And so they made a commitment to kind of undertake some move into that and to bring the firm with it. And that was really, of course, the precautionary list that those of you know that we introduced at Greenbuild in 2008 or 2009, almost a decade ago. But it started with a really simple list of what are 25 substances that you guys don't think we should be speccing in buildings anymore. Like, give us the list. And then that's a tool that we can give to the people in the firm. So that was really how it started. It would not have started if senior management didn't sort of will it to begin in a firm the size of Perkins & Will. There could have been a lot of people interested at their desks, but it wouldn't have risen to that level and to invest in the research and the work.
Critical.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about the first step when you're thinking about incorporating this? Would you agree, first of all, Allison, that the senior management support, I know you've worked in your capacity here as an educator and also working with some firms that you're helping and assisting to do this, but oftentimes, even if you have that decision, how do you get started? I mean, is a tough one.
Yeah, I think to Robin's point is you have to give, well, I think first of all, we have to broaden the community that we're working in. And I think that a lot of this work is rested in the hands of a few people in firms. And it feels to me that what really needs to happen is that we as designers, as architects, interior designers, need to lead a conversation. So we're not relying on others to provide us this information, the experts in our offices. I'm sorry, but really kind of speak to our own expertise and our interests as architects and designers in wanting to create better spaces for everyone. And I think when we do that as a fundamental first step, we do want to create better spaces. We don't want to create spaces that are full of toxics for us. So I think getting designers on board with this as a critical piece of a design practice is really important. And then once we've got them over that first hurdle of understanding there's a problem, the next step is like, what do you do? What's that first step? And one of the things we talk about a lot is kind of developing a framework of how we act as designers. How do we guide our decision-making in a way that allows us to act and not be disabled by too much information, which is kind of the problem and the challenge sometimes. So we've developed a few steps. I know that a lot of offices have done that working in this field, developed a framework that they work within, and also setting targets, like what are you trying to do? And sometimes it can be just that first step of, you know what, we're going to look at eliminating vinyl from the products that we use in our projects going forward. Really simple step, but it has the capacity to fundamentally disrupt and change a system, I think, which is really important, and obviously has great positive health impacts on the occupants of buildings. So I think, first of all, the first step is getting people on board as designers. It's a critical part of our job as designers to incorporate this knowledge, and then coming up with systems and a framework that really help people make better decisions.
How do you get people on board that don't already know about it? What kind of things have you done?
Allison's very persuasive.
Very persuasive. You know, this was a new topic for me, and in fact, Amanda Kaminsky is the reason that I'm actually involved in this at all. But for me, it's information. You know, we as architects and designers really like information. It's like there's a problem with this wall. There's a problem with this floor. Nobody told me this was a problem. Now that I know it's a problem, I'm not going to be specifying those products anymore. It's a really simple step, I think, from not knowing anything to being an advocate in this space. So I think that is that's important. It is just to provide the information of and identifying what the problem is. Sorry, guys.
So, you know, having heard that, John, I know you have been through this both within your own firm as well as as a consulting firm. You assist others who are trying to go down this path. What's been your experience with this decision process? And, you know, are there some typical roadblocks that you find you run into or kind of repeat themselves? And how have you worked with that? What's been your experience?
So yes, first of all, the answer is, of course, there have been roadblocks.
Okay, there are no roadblocks. We can all go home.
I think, you know, the biggest you know, the biggest issue we see as roadblocks is just the lack of education that most designers have in this field. It's not something that up to this point has been taught as part of the architect's education, and so it is new, and I think there is an interest in new information, as Allison said, but there's also a sense of is this in the typical realm of the designer? And if it is, you know, what's the way to get your head around it, to grasp it, and figure out how to use this new information and use it for making decisions. You know, I know in our practice that we had the opportunity to, you know, as people who do a lot of work with LEED and other rating systems, you know, to sort of keep our tabs on what was going on, and we certainly heard feedback from clients that you know, other than say things like, you know, energy, which is a pretty straightforward thing for clients to understand about the benefits they get, that there was a lot of interest in this idea of creating healthier environments, and what are the, you know, how do you push that further than, let's say, what LEED was doing, you know, say 5 years ago or so. So we were trying to understand where opportunities were, and you know, fortunately, organizations like the Health Product Declaration Collaborative and Healthy Building Network and Perkins and Will were starting to show new directions, you know, more sophisticated directions in how one could really evaluate materials. And so from our perspective, we were outreaching to clients about opportunities to try to use this for clients in particular who really wanted to look more stringently into this idea of improving indoor air quality and wellness in their buildings. And you know, we were very fortunate to find some clients, including where Amanda used to work, that were very interested in this and allowed us to work with them to explore some of those things. And you know, there's nothing better than an interested client to really push these things along and make a lot of things happen. And that's been something that we've been able to take advantage of. And also, but you know, it does take a lot of work to try to persuade people that this is something that is definitely worthwhile and something that they can integrate into their projects.
Well, what you're suggesting, you know, my background is I was a business school professor in addition to a software engineer, and you know, we think about there's a value proposition or a business ROI or something along those lines, and I think what we're talking about here are all kind of elements of that, right? And I know, Amanda, you know, one of the experiences that you had was really making that case to a building owner, right, where you were working as their sustainability head. And maybe you could comment a little bit about how, in that case, maybe some of these things we're talking about, the senior management support, the focus, the education, having the framework, did you see those coming together? And how did it net out for business people who are developers to make the case?
Yeah. Well, you know, I came into contact with the whole idea of all of this through some contractors on a construction site who, when I was pregnant, basically called out to me that I shouldn't be near the materials that they were installing on a regular basis. And once you kind of start to learn more and dig in and know some of these things, it's really hard to unknow them, right? And so it just kind of became well, we have to address this in my mind. And so then you're right, how do I make that case to other people that I'm working with? And so what we really started to discuss a lot was the idea of liability, and also thinking, I mean, our clients when I was working for that building owner, are the occupants, the tenants. And so we do what we need to do to keep our tenants happy and healthy and safe, right? And so when we think about liability, for us, it's interesting, there's been a lot of discussion about liability in the way of more transparent data, making the knowers of that data more liable. But we actually saw that very differently. We were thinking of it as, what we don't know can become a liability. And so the more transparent, the more we can know, the less liable we could be on anything. And frankly, the health, you can't really go wrong. The healthier you make something, the better you make something, and it's just good business. And whether you're talking about an interior space and the occupants that are in that space, or the supply chains and all of the the manufacturers that you like to work with. I mean, these are relationships that build and strengthen over time, ideally. And the communities that are affected around those manufacturing sites, the recyclers that you work with, and the communities that are around landfills. All of these things are part of doing business in real estate development. And the healthier you can make these different environments throughout the manufacture and use and recycling of a product, the better off you're going to be in business. And so luckily I was working with some really smart people. At least I thought. I thought I had a good argument, and they are people that really look long term, and I think that's also a really big key to all of this. There's a more investment of time and commitment of just headspace to really get into this stuff and master it, which I don't know if I definitely have not mastered it. I think it takes a while, but I think we're all kind of growing and moving in that direction and progressing in that direction together. And so I think if you have a long-term outlook about the impacts of what you do today, you're going to be more convinced that this makes sense.
Other thoughts? Is there anyone in the audience who'd like to join in, ask a question? Other thoughts from the panel on this topic? What are the key elements in reaching a firm-level decision to introduce transparency and material health practices into your firm's projects? Anyone out here?
I wonder if there's geographic variability across the United States in terms of design firms and where their interest lies in pushing material health, and if there are certain areas that are more progressive than others in that area.
So I think it's surprising. I'd like to say that it's clear, like you could find a blue state, red state difference, or you could find that people in Texas aren't going to touch this because it's the center of oil and gas. But that doesn't seem to be the case. That I think this idea of health kind of transcends a lot of those, what we think of as those political or ideological boundaries, almost more than I would say LEED did, and the kind of theory of the generalized good that came with doing LEED buildings. Absolutely, we can look at our portfolio of LEED certifications and see that there's regional variation that is statistically, relevant for areas of the country, but not so with material health work. So I don't see that. I was actually going to go back to that question just for a second and say that, the business case, like someone who's doing rental apartments might make a business case that you could charge maybe slightly, you could market a healthier space and maybe turn that in to a delta in rent. That's maybe what LEED would have said. A LEED certified apartment building translates into a little more dollars per month on rent. I don't think in a firm, like we didn't really believe there was a financial ROI around our interest in material health. It was really more about, design excellence and seeing that material health is another facet of design excellence. I also think for Perkins and Will, there was, it is a firm that's been around for 80 years. And so I think there was a kind of moment of recognizing that your portfolio of buildings actually goes back before that time that you talked about, Wendy, that, we did school buildings in 1935 to 1940, which is before petrochemical materials were introduced, before the Second World War. And I think there was kind of an interest in the firm about really wondering what the trajectory of an 80-year practice is. Have we been making our buildings more toxic inadvertently because we didn't know, to your point, Allison, like we just didn't know. Nobody set out to do that. And it's been an interesting dialogue in the firm, particularly cross-generational dialogue among kind of people that I consider to be the people who have been detailing and specifying architectural building products since the 1960s, right? And learned from people who were doing it in the 30s and 40s, right? That was who mentored them. And so really them being able to sit back and say, wow, in my span of a 50-year career, how have materials changed, has been a kind of interesting conversation in our technical practice.
I'm just curious, our panelists are out and about with lots of different firms and colleagues working on different projects. If you had to estimate, all of your firms are involved with this, but what do you think is the percentage of architecture and design firms out in the world and in the US, let's just leave it to that have made that same decision as your firms? Any guesstimates at this point? We know we're early on.
Small, right? It's small, I think. I mean, you get trailblazers like Parsons and Will, right? And Snowhester, for example, Snowhester. I mean, it depends who you're working with. The client sometimes is driving this. So Snowhester did a project with Harvard, and Harvard has huge sustainability building initiatives. So the client is driving them, and they also have an interest in materials anyway, but it's driving them to push beyond perhaps what they might typically do. So,
well, I do think in the large firm roundtable in the US, where Perkins & Will is one member of a fairly robust group of the largest firms in the country, and they meet and talk about everything except pricing services, because that would be illegal, right? So they just talk about issues of practice. And I would say that sustainability and material health has been a topic of discussion at the large firm roundtable. And I certainly believe our peer firms are doing really good work in this space. We are not by any means alone. And I think, the profession of architecture has a load of influence among the top tier firms just because of the scale and dollar volume of the work that we produce.
Is that 100? What, top tier?
Yeah, maybe there's 50 to 100. I mean, aren't there usually like top 50 lists or whatever, there's that are sizable. And then there are a load of individual practitioners that all come to the AIA convention to get their CEUs. And they're, from all over the country. And I think that group of architects is much less aware of this than the people who are working for the top 50 firms. Like, I
would interrogate that just a little bit. I think there's an awareness, but I don't know whether that awareness is impacting practice.
Yeah, that's really
Yeah. So I think that the top tier firms may be paying lip service to it or are generally interested, but I don't think it's fundamentally changing their practice yet. Yeah. Right. And then we've got the mid firms, right? In the mid firm where you're really, it's a tough business, as we know. So taking on this new material is difficult for them. So I think we're still early days, it feels like to me.
I've worked in a firm where basically where it was motivated by clients to start doing healthy materials, which became a very large client for us and became a large part of us. And that's been like maybe close to 10 years. But I think now what I see from other clients and maybe from the way that we approach our, when we go to proposals and things like that, we will always bring up health. But I find that we do a lot of commercial interiors, that in commercial interiors, you now have a client body or user body, not necessarily the client themselves, but the people in the spaces that expect the places that they work to make them healthy, certainly not to harm them. And that expectation is really growing a lot in terms of the young people who are in offices, not only from the clients, but from the people who work for them.
Just a kind of a business school metric, right, to think about where, this tipping point might come in. You kind of have to get up to around 10% of the participants to kind of push it up into that next more accelerated. And that's, one of the reasons we're doing this session is to start to get more awareness about what actually can be done, as opposed to, this would be a nice thing to do sometime when it's possible. We really want to start to get across the message that there are firms, and we'll have other participants in our next series as well that are coming from smaller size firms. And Susan Kaplan from HLW, not one of the largest firms. And I know, John, you have some clients as well that are in that smaller category. So it's really getting a coalescence of people in different places. Please.
I also think, as a consultant and, as you mentioned, we tend to work with a variety of different firm sizes and different project sizes. And, so we do see that while the interest may be there at different scales of firm, that definitely the ability to designate resources towards this effort can vary quite a bit. And it's my personal feeling that where this, the profession as a whole is going to have to move, and I think is moving, is towards, some sort of more consolidated set of resources that are going to lead the way for the practitioners who can't afford to designate a full-time person or half-time person to just be researching materials and trying to get up to speed. And I do think those opportunities are going to start to happen, and you're going to start to see a lot more people being able to adopt at least, some level of this into their daily, daily way they go about doing things. But because I definitely think it's not a matter of, not wanting to do it. I think, as Robin said, I think even more so, like you say, more so than lead, the idea of health and wellness is just sort of resonates with almost everybody who's in the design field. It's just a matter of saying, really, how do I implement it? And maybe we'll have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about that in some of these other questions as well.
Well, I think hang on to that, because we're going to shift to the second topic at this point, and I'd like to ask John, you to address our first question in this area. So exactly on this point, assuming that there is support within the firm, at least at the level of perhaps starting out with some projects, how do you approach preparing the practitioners in the firm to effectively practice transparency in material health? I think it's been pointed out by several of the speakers so far that education, is one of the biggest impediments, because at this point in time, very few practitioners have had any education during their formal education. One of the initiatives several of us are working on is how we can propose undergraduate and graduate degree program curriculum that can actually be adopted as a regular part of an architecture and interior design program. And ultimately, if you think about it, we all believe, I imagine if you're here today, you believe this is really important, but when you think about you can become a licensed practitioner without really demonstrating any knowledge of this, it's a little bit, like the stories we hear about sometimes medicine and nutrition, where they've been separate fields. And I think a big part of what this effort is about is that cross-disciplinary activity to say this can no longer remain the domain of just someone in toxicology or chemistry or industrial health. We have to bring those practitioners in and their knowledge in, but the next step is really incorporating it into the day-to-day work that we do. So given the fact that most practices, if they make the decision to start to do this, are not going to have a widely educated or trained group of people, John, what are some of the first steps that can be taken? I mean, do you start by, you talked about, I think, a framework, or maybe Allison did, I think you talked about it as well. Is that a good starting point? Just leave it up to people to get self-educated? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think, like our practice, and I'm guessing in most, started with a core group of individuals who were particularly interested in this topic and who really started to spend some time initially, I think, sort of observing what was out there in this field. What were the main resources, who was doing what, how could we start to get ourselves educated and at least up to speed on some of the major issues. And once we started to do that, then within our group, we were able to then start to share this information. And I do think what we found is that there have been three or four critical things that have allowed us to develop further and to bring more people into this area, even within our own practice. And one of them is starting to establish that framework, both of resources and of discussing, what does the screening process really mean? How do you, what do you have to think about even when you get the information on materials to start to decide what might be preferable to something else? And what we find is this is sort of an iterative thing. We keep gaining more information and more expertise as we go along and look at more and more materials. And what we have tried to do in that process is, by going through that process, we're also developing a series of, say, vetted products that we start to, accumulate, so that we start to realize, once we've made the effort and found certain things that we feel are preferable to others, that's a database, loosely saying a database that people can use. And the other thing, we try to memorialize these decision-making processes through a set of what I'll call spec criteria. Like, what are the performance criteria that we've sort of established for this particular material type that we want to replicate when we go to the next project, or improve upon, or add to. And so we didn't necessarily think this all through ahead of time. We couldn't really. We just sort of developed it as we went along. But what we've started to realize is that, when you start to be able to have these points where people can jump in and very quickly start to look at the products that have been considered preferable, to look at the spec criteria and see what they are, and then start to ask questions about, how did you decide this? How did you decide that? It becomes a much quicker way to get people up to speed and get them engaged in this issue as well. And so so far that's been a pretty successful basis for us to start to implement this in the office, and keeping that sort of group of expertise and people who continue to get better at it, but then bringing in more as time goes on.
So when you say memorialize, are you suggesting you develop some internal tools or databases? How did you navigate the expertise to do that kind of work?
It was really based mostly on the projects that we were working on. So, we were faced with very practical considerations where, someone came to us and said, we've got these, paints we're using, or this wood flooring, or these resilient floors, and, what can you, how do we know which ones are preferable to others? And so again, looking at the resources that were out there, and seeing what some of the experts in the industry already had to say about some of these things, getting the product specific information where something like an HPD can be incredibly valuable to actually look at an individual product and see what's inside of it and then compare it to other similar products. What we started to do again was to, I would say for us, probably more than anything, the spec criteria start to capture a lot of it, because we start to say, wait a minute, we realize that some of these products have a certain percentage of this specific chemical that we don't really want in it. And if there are products that don't use this at all, we can start to identify that can be an exclusion. If there are products that all use this, but there are some that really use much less than others and have different formulations, then we start to memorialize that and say, well, no more than, this percentage of this, material in this product. And little decisions like that start to add up over time for us, at least, and create a set of criteria that then we can start to discuss with others.
Yeah. So sort of a stepping stone approach, it sounds like. Amanda, I'm kind of curious, going back to your experience, when we hear about these programs, they're almost always our champions. And I think one of the questions that firms sometimes get into that's come to my attention is, at what point do we just move out from relying on those couple of champions and start to spread the knowledge more generally within the practitioner base? Because it's easy to have, if you have such impassioned people and they become more and more expert, it can become kind of a default to say, well, let's get so and so in here, and we hear that often, right? But how do you kind of move beyond that step, or were you successful in your experience to take that? I think you were, so kind of curious how you approached that.
Well, maybe
even
instead
to
of
construction firms and some of the other participants, right? That you.
I mean, maybe instead of champion, I would call myself a nudge in every single meeting, But the way we started off was really, it was with just me and a couple of consultants who are in the room right here, John and Catherine. Where it was more about information gathering and less about, a full-on capability to factor all that information into every decision yet. But, we knew we had a great tool in the HPD that existed, but there weren't a lot of HPDs yet when we first started doing this. And so, we kind of first set off to say, okay, we're just going to ask for HPDs on pretty much every product and make sure that those HPDs are delivered by the time the contractor or the subcontractor gets their final payment. So it was more about then having that data gathering for then informing our subsequent projects. And so as we got the specifications in place to then not just prompt for that information, but then start to learn from that information, we were able to then empower our architecture and engineering consultants to abide by those and uphold those in the product selections that were made on the projects. And a lot of them really started to champion that with us and got very excited about it and very invested.
Written protocols? I mean,
I
when
would say
you
the
say
specification
empower,
was
the specification was the lever?
Yeah, it really
Okay.
was. I mean, and we had some internal tools and, like John's saying, kind of some favorite products that we started to develop over time, and also just manufacturers that were really getting it and very supportive of what we were looking for, even if they couldn't fully comply with ingredients that we didn't want in there yet. You can just tell when you have a manufacturer kind of with you that really gets and wants the same thing that you do, And so that collaboration with those manufacturers has been really so consistently important. And I think, the buy-in from different people around the firm that then also became champions just kind of happened in different ways where, there was a person that was very interested in our construction and demolition recycling rates. And they really got that these requirements for understanding more about content led to our recyclers understanding better how to recycle those materials, and help to inform what we should be excluding too. So it was just sort of an interesting way that some of the development of other quote unquote champions or nudges came about internally, but also with our network of consultants that are our partners in doing the work that we did. So I don't think it has to be internal people that have to play that role, right?
Well, yeah, and external people are critical, right?
Yeah.
In
Well,
projects, spreading out beyond just the core.
And it's kind of nice that then pollinates other projects after yours. And I think that everybody benefits when there's more people doing the same thing you're doing with regard to this work, because then it just makes everybody's work easier.
It sounds like enthusiasm was a big part of it as well. I mean, seriously, the nudge part, there's a level of enthusiasm. So Robin, looking at the experience at Perkins and Will, I mean, in talking with a lot of different of the larger, top firms, one thing that has impressed me is the extent to which Perkins and Will has developed a pretty extensive network, and obviously focused on spreading this beyond one or two experts somewhere. But I wonder if you could comment, just looking back on this, sort of what stands out for you as you move from the decision of the firm to sort of move ahead with this, which you already mentioned. You have very strong senior leadership support. You as a leader were sort of championing this, and then taking the next step of sort of bringing this firm-wide, developing tools such as a precautionary list. I mean, are there lessons that stand out from that phase of things for you?
There certainly are. I would say, first of all, I wholeheartedly agree with what Amanda just said, that what I've noticed over the years in doing that work is that there's a tendency for the people doing it to want to hold it close. And because they're really so deep in it and they're so passionate about it, and that they believe that's the only way for it to be accurate enough or good enough or complete enough, or and so actually, the first iteration of the precautionary list was done by a really tiny, like you could count them on less than one hand, group of people in a 2,000 person practice. And so one of my learnings about a 2,000 person practice is that that's not a good way to change culture. That you need like the 1,000 points of light. And so it almost actually died because people decide to get another job, or they decide that they're gonna go do something else. And if it's like 2 or 3 people, it's like over. And so we've really taken this approach of having it be sort of a much larger, more sort of seasoned group of people. But I would say, actually, this is the other point that my big takeaway from this is that it's one thing to focus on how are you going to teach people how to read an HPD, or what an endocrine disruptor is, or why PVC is bad. It's another thing entirely to teach a group of professionals how to take that information and make it part of the story of their project. And that's where I think the next, what I think in our firm is that for this to go deeper and for this to really penetrate the work. I mean, it's interesting, Allison, that you said, well, transform your firm. Trust me, material health has not transformed Perkins and Will. It's first of all, how do you measure, right? And the only measurement that we've been able to sort of even begin to do is that we have this precautionary list, and we ask people have to report for the Design Excellence Annual Review. We call it the DEAR Review. So every designer in the firm has their portfolio evaluated every year, right? So, and so when you submit the body of work by a jury that is Perkins and Will and outside jurors, right? So there's a submission in January where you have to submit your portfolio, and it's, very specific slides. It's completely prescribed, but we added the lead slide Like, how are you doing about the 2030 challenge? How are you doing about water consumption? How are you doing? And now we added, have you done a precautionary list review, right? Last January, it was 60% of the projects. So, like, it's not everybody. I mean, it was up from
But what might it have
40% the
been?
year before, or
What-
20% the year before.
That's
like,
the point, really.
like it's better. And you know, that material health group, the material performance group, is really actually focused on it being 100% this January, right?
So having
That's been their goal, right?
and that's spread out in all your offices,
across the practices. But doing the review is different than changing what you specify.
It's the
Oh
first
yeah,
step.
we reviewed, right? We have all these things, all these materials on our project. They don't ask that question. So how many materials don't meet the precautionary list? It's just, did you look, right? Yeah. So, you know, but you have to start somewhere, right? And I think that bigger question of how do you ask designers, both architectural designers and interior designers, to really start thinking about how the materials impact the story of their project is a place we haven't gone yet in education, but I think it's the next frontier. I mean, and what I mean by that, the concrete example is, would you build a school building with materials that were asthma triggers? Probably not, right? So where are the interiors people doing the schoolwork who are saying the story of this project is a story about building a school for kids that doesn't have endocrine disruptors or asthmagens? Like, and then that's how they use all the data to make better choices, right? And that's like, that's a design education issue. That's an innovation issue. But, you know.
I think that's a really powerful concept. And let's hold on that because I think it's actually the topic of our next question. But we have a question from the audience.
So it sounds like everyone sort of spoke developing a framework internally being a critical point of getting it adopted throughout the company, but these have all been developed internally to the specific firms. Are any of these available to firms outside, like software that's been developed then that firms can take on, or is this the kind of thing that basically every firm has their own Excel sheets and they're not sharing them?
That's a good question. You know, it would be interesting, you know, our precautionary list is available, right? And our transparency website is available. We would love other firms to use our transparency website. We love it. But, you know, the checklist that projects use to review the precautionary list, I don't think that's up on the transparency website, but it could be. I mean, it's an interesting question. I don't see why we wouldn't. Like,
yeah, one of the reasons we're all here today, and again, we want to thank you all, our audience, both live and on live stream, for participating with us, is we're going to take the information that we're surfacing here and start to look at these next steps and start to prioritize resources from our organization, our partnering organizations, to exactly try and get to there. You know, at this point, what we do have available are the source documents, right? So the HPDs and other documents like that you can find. We're working on a specifier guide so that it would have specifications, template specifications, which was mentioned by Amanda as so critical in their spreading this out. I know we've talked, John, with you about some of the matrices that you have and how that information might play in. So I think that's coming, and it's great to hear that, you know, people would want that, because I know myself, you know, as when I was in the business world, I'm doing this initiative now, but as a business person, you think, oh, it's all about competition and so on. But I can tell you this, we had a lot of best practice sharing among ourselves, because we knew that if we could lift the practice of others, even our competitors, the leaders have a greater opportunity to show how advanced they are. If most of the people aren't doing whatever your advancement is, it becomes really difficult to make the case to clients that this is valuable, because they look around and they say, well, I don't know, somehow you're the only one doing this. How important could this be? So, it really is in the interests of industry participants, particularly leaders, and it can seem a little counterintuitive, but if you look at the progress of major initiatives, my own background's in the high-tech industry, and you look at how it is that we have, these kind of devices that are like supercomputers of 20 years ago, and we all have them. A lot of that was really the industry participants pushing on each other to move better, faster, cheaper with new products and innovation. So I think, to the extent, one of our goals here, and you see people from the industry participating here, is to get this information into the hands of more people. So let's move on to that next question. We framed it here in our questions about clients, but I think the way you reframed it, Robin, about the story of the project is really powerful. Whether I'm telling that story to my client, whether the school department, where we're building the school, maybe the most powerful thing right now is telling the story internally to ourselves, right? And convincing ourselves that the effort necessary, change takes effort, and the effort necessary to make that step and not just repeat, what we did the last project, but do something different. It introduces risk, it introduces new ideas, it may introduce more work, it usually does. So Allison, I know your field here is the education and really thinking about how to introduce new ideas and change, and perhaps you could share some comments on how people might go about approaching this.
I'll try speaking into the mic more clearly also. I think the storytelling piece of this is really important. And I think that, how do we tell that story? How do we tell that story to each other? How do we tell it to others in our field? And then how do we tell the story effectively to owners and developers? And they're different groups, right? The owner is different from the developer. And we've been using this, and you've all used it too, I'm sure, that, we're the first generation to spend more than 90% of our time indoors. This is our environment. And this is the place that we create. We build our environment now. And then our environment, this environment that we build, becomes us. And that's, your body burden conversations, Robin. So we are different beings than we were before. And we have created this new form of humanity. And I think that as we start to kind of delve into that as information, we start to see the implications of that. And as we think of the statistics that these interior environments may be 3 to 5 times more toxic than the environments outside, it refocuses a conversation about sustainability that sometimes has sat out in the forest, and in the streams, and it starts to reposition it into these places that we create. Those, I think, are the powerful stories for architects and designers. And those are the kind of the images I have in my head every time I think about materials selection or I think about design. I'm thinking, am I really going to be creating a better place? I better be, because I know what the alternative is. So I think that helps those decision makers make better decisions if they have the tools and resources available to them to help them. And I think the stories for developers and owners are slightly different. Owners are long-term owners of spaces, and they do have a different relationship to occupants, I think, than developers do. And I think as we focus on occupant health, an owner really is in a position to say, there's an advantage, obviously, to me to create a better space for the people who work or live in my spaces. Joe Allen has all of this great new research out of Harvard Chan School of Public Health, really looking at increases in worker productivity and reduction in sick days and general well-being, this sense of I'm working in a better place. Those studies really, I think, are great studies to point to as we make the case to owners of really saying, where everyone is trying to keep, the good people that are working for them happy in the spaces that they're working in, so that they're more productive and so that they stay and contribute in a way that is valuable and important to the organization. So I think there's a lot of new research in that space of why healthier places are better for all of us, that I think are good arguments to make to owners. And I still think the developer, the value of these spaces to developers is really the value proposition, the marketing angle, in that you really can say, my building is more valuable because it is a healthier place for me to live. So I think, depending on your audience, the message changes. But I'm with Robin that human health is something that is fundamental and that really viscerally impacts, appeals to us. We understand what it means. And so I think when we have a conversation that is grounded in human health, we can make really powerful arguments that hold a lot of weight.
Yeah, that certainly sounds pretty resonant to me. I'd hate to be up against that argument, trying to argue. But sometimes we know that despite our best efforts to put our foot forward, it may be that we aren't able to make the case. And I'm wondering if any of you have had that experience and, where it looked promising perhaps, and then it didn't work out. Maybe John, just start with you. I know you've had a variety of experiences giving this a go. Are some cases that we can learn from where it didn't work out as you'd hoped it would?
I mean, we probably the biggest issue I've seen along those lines is clients who we've proposed to do this type of investigation in a fairly comprehensive way, and they've kind of backed out of it a little bit. And it's been, the reasons I would say have been kind of interesting because they weren't not necessarily what we expected. I mean, we talked a little bit earlier about like return on investment, things like that. A lot of our indicators from some of the work we've done is that this wasn't really, we weren't really talking about major cost impacts, because a lot of the research was, kind of working within a realm of products that were roughly within the same cost, field and within products that a lot of their designers were probably familiar with. What was surprising to me was that some of the issues that came up were things like, we don't know how to market this, because what can we actually say we've done? If you've gone in and you've actually looked at certain materials and you've removed some of the toxic content, you've found things with lower emissions, but it's really hard to make that into a simple, sort of market ready type of statement to a client that they're trying to propose it to. And sometimes they've also, interestingly enough, noted that we're also a little cautious about, again, what we can say here, because then everything we've done before or other projects we're working on now where we're not doing this, are we basically by definition saying those are bad projects compared to this? So, we've had to kind of, work with clients like that to try to, in some respects, I think from the decision of, should we do it or not compared to other buildings, to just say, don't get too hung up about maybe exactly how much you can say. Take the step. It's about what kind of choices you make, right? You make choices about material selections all the time for all different reasons. This is just another level of reasons for you to make choices, and it doesn't necessarily have to be absolutely scientifically validated that this is going to be a healthier building, because it's kind of like saying, if I eat, organic fruits and vegetables, can I absolutely prove without a doubt that this is going to make me healthier than not? Maybe it's not exactly that precise, but you sort of know that this is the right direction. And that's where things like the precautionary principle are really helpful to get the right framework, I think, of their thinking about this sort of thing.
So don't push it too hard. Just sort of take what you can get and
let them-
and that stepwise progression.
I think once the process starts and they start to see what comes out of it, I think it's a lot more understandable about like okay, they're not as worried about what might come out of this process, and they start to realize that some of the decisions that are being made are things that would be very easy to implement in many other projects. So it sort of has a benefit beyond just one project. And the other thing I would say is that, I know this is something that our office is experimenting with, but I do believe, I think what Allison and Robin were saying about the story is really critical. We're trying to look at it from a slightly, shall I say, more mechanistic perspective of the rating system. We're experimenting with this idea of taking evaluations we've done for products and trying to rate a range of upgrades, if you will, for certain product types of what we believe are things that make it, better than others, and then wrap that into a system that says if you take certain space types like an apartment or a house or a classroom, you can do takeoffs of quantities, plug these ratings of the materials in, and come up with a rating for this space that is similar in concept to something like a LEED or a WELL, but not quite as in depth, but also very specific to materials. And because I do think at the end of the day, we're trying to respond to this question from developers about, I need something simple to say to people that we did make an effort, we did, spend, our due diligence and a lot of time trying to make good decisions. But, if I start to say, well, I reduced my, phthalates by, 35% over the resilient flooring, most of the general public doesn't really get that, and they may not really understand what that benefit is to them. So I think there are probably other people who will come up with other solutions, but I know that's something we're trying to try out on a few projects to see if it has some resonance at the end of the day.
Other thoughts on this one?
Well, I can tell a story about a material. Maybe I may not name names, but the material does have a name. We just did a pretty large project, and we had decided that we were going to do a lobby floor that was lithocrete. So it was the pre-epoxy version of terrazzo, right? So it's like everything old is new again. You kind of go back to the way they used to do terrazzo before epoxy was invented, and you're going to do this floor. And we thought it was really a great idea because it didn't have BPA and it didn't, and this was a children's facility, and wouldn't that be great, right? And the owner was like totally bought in, no PVC, no BPA, this will be great, healthier environment for kids on the floor, blah, 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 right? So, you make decisions on a really big project in about year 2, and then they're actually laying the floor in year 8, right? Year 7, right? You're lucky if anybody who sat in the room making the material decision is actually still working for the owner or whatever, right? And the contractor comes along in year 8 because, of course, the building's over budget and behind schedule, and says to the owner, we're going to give you a really big credit if you'll just let us use epoxy. We'll give you $150,000 back if we can do epoxy because the cure time is quicker, it's a little more reliable, blah, 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 blah. And of course, my material health warriors go crazy and they start emailing, how dare they think about substituting this floor? How dare they, who are paying for the building and paying, $700 million to build a building that is late and over budget? How dare they even entertain this substitution? And you realize, of course, and I sort of had to calm everybody down and say, it's their building. And this is one of many decisions that they're going to be faced with over the next 2 years with every finished product that's going into that building. And they have to believe it. They have to believe the same thing they believed 6 years ago. Or you'll get that floor and then they'll be putting, they'll be putting wax on it or something. They either believe in a healthy building or they don't. So all you can do is calmly remind them about why they didn't have epoxy to begin with and what the health implications of that are, calmly, without a political overtone, right? And say, you know, do you still believe this? Because if you do, you won't take this 150,000. They go, they do it. The owner says, you're right, we're not taking the $150,000. They're like, yes, we won. 2 months later, a week before the pour, it's $300,000 if you just do epoxy. And they caved. For $300,000, they caved. But, you know, that's what we're all faced with. Like, we can be as resolute about this as we want, but if we don't have a story that the owner really believes in, and that all those people who are behind and over budget and doing all the Excel spreadsheets feel strongly enough about to hold the line, you lose it in the, you know, in the 10th inning. Like, so that's why I think this idea that the story has to be really powerful, and it's got to be, and I don't think getting strident or overly political works. These owners have a lot on their minds. You know, they've got financing deadlines, they've got, you know, they're making a load of decisions that we as their design professionals don't necessarily always understand. And so, you know, you want to be with them shoulder to shoulder. You can't get too far in front of them ideologically, and you certainly can't, of course, be behind them. You have to figure out how to move alongside them to get this stuff to all happen the way you want.
So that timing dimension, I think that's a really critical point, Robin, you know, where these projects are taking years, right? And the spec is way over here, and then there's all these people in the migration. I mean, these are really amazing things for us to start to think about as we tackle this next wave. What I want to do is just give an opportunity. We have had a couple of comments from people on the live stream, and so Abby, do you want to just tell us a little bit about it?
Sure, I will just read this comment aloud for somebody from the panel to comment on. This audience member offered a quick analogy saying designers should have an understanding of the legal aspects of contract documents, but attorneys actually write the contract documents for projects. This is analogous to designers having an understanding of material health, i.e. championing, but specialists with expertise in toxicology or industrial hygiene are required to actually deliver a healthier building. Exposure science and toxicology are extremely complex with multiple factors that must be considered to make an informed decision. The expectation that designers can quickly acquire this knowledge and expertise is unrealistic. I would argue that there need to be more specialists with education and expertise in toxicology and/or industrial hygiene working at firms and on projects.
Who'd like to respond?
I mean, I'll say that it was very helpful to have a certified industrial hygienist working with us on our projects. I'll also say that it, you know, I think that it enabled us to do some pretty advanced work. I think also that it shouldn't prevent somebody from delving into asking for transparent health data if you don't have access or the funding to have a certified industrial hygienist on board. So while I agree with some aspects of that comment, I think it shouldn't, that shouldn't be an obstacle to jumping into this space.
Yeah, one of the thoughts we've had about this is that as this field evolves, it's going to be very much like many of the other specialties that the architecture and design world deals with. The one I often use is structural engineering, where architecture and design professionals learn the basics of that in their curriculum, have a level of expertise, but would not be the people creating the engineering diagrams, right? And so there's, I think, as the field of material health evolves, we're going to see exactly what the person commented, where there's an interplay between these. I think where we're at right now is simply equipping the architecture and design professionals to understand what this is and start to seed the demand. And we happen to have with us this evening such a professional, Catherine Bovenhausen. Would you like to just add your thoughts on this?
Yes. Well, I wanted to say that I have been involved from quite a long time with John Amatruda and Amanda, and working on the material health issue, looking at the depth of understanding the dimensions that go behind some of these things, and working with the HPDC on embedding industrial hygiene principles in those documents. And I agree that architects should have a fundamental knowledge, but if there are areas where their expertise and their backgrounds really don't lend, then the industrial hygienist plays a really pivotal role. And I would certainly like my profession to be more recognized in this area and be considered, for example, like an acoustical consultant or a lighting specialist. It's very critical to have that kind of depth of knowledge and understanding of the occupation that go in, and the whole chain of exposures that might relate to.
Can I just say one more thing too, building on what Catherine just said? We had a lot of conversations with manufacturers that were involved in our projects, and Catherine was on a lot of those calls. And I feel like that interaction was really key to, there were some manufacturers, actually the majority of manufacturers, I'll say, were very collaborative and really wanted to hear what we had to say and were really on board. But especially for the ones that weren't, it was so important and helpful to have Catherine's engagement to to help us understand where a stated obstacle was a real obstacle and where it wasn't, and where there could be alternatives. And so Catherine was really pivotal to that, to helping us move forward with that collaboration.
Yeah, one of the next phases I think we're going to have is to actually start to see the evolution of these specialties. I think the lighting specialists, the acoustic specialists, the structural engineers, all of the others who participate ultimately in the project. We're in the early stages, right, of creating the places where those interventions are important to happen. So, John, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thought, which is that while I absolutely agree that having specialists like an industrial hygienist and others is critical, and I do think over time you're going to see much more thorough analyses done on looking at different products. I do think we have to be a little bit careful about this idea that we can't move on anything until we have this absolute proof, kind of like I was saying before. I mean, I just don't think that's realistic, and I think in some respects people use it as a cop-out. It's kind of like what I was saying before about, with organic food or something like that. If you said, I'm never going to eat a piece of organic food because until somebody absolutely proves that there's without a shadow of a doubt a absolute benefit to this, then, you could wait the rest of your life perhaps before something like that happens. These are very complicated issues we're talking about with all kinds of synthetic chemicals that have shown up in people's blood and urine, and so we know that they're getting into our bodies. But if you go out to the medical profession even, it's like they don't have answers to all these things about exactly what the cause and effect is for a lot of these things. So I think this idea that you want to be precautionary about it. You want to have the engagement of the manufacturers to say that if we've identified compounds in these materials that we have concerns about, that the real question to me is not so much, what's the exact, health risk factor of this chemical being in the product, but why is the chemical in the product to begin with, and are there alternatives, and do we really need it? Because I think that's a potential way to get to the endpoint we want to get to without having to rely on some notion of the science is going to tell us the answer in any kind of time frame that would be realistic for us to take action.
Yeah, I think realistically we're in the good, better, best world of today, where we can say certain things, perhaps represent a baseline of what is possible on a lot of projects. And then there are things that we can say are probably better based on the precautionary principle and other ways of doing that. And we can strive toward products that, completely eliminate this. As we've started to work with the data, we've come to see that the vast majority of products that we use on a daily basis do in fact have one or more of these what are called chemicals of concern in them. And so, however, some have less. And so I think that's a lot of the focus of where practice is today. We're running to the end of our time now, so I'd just like to ask each of our panelists to perhaps make some closing comments. What is the best advice you could give the design practitioner to get started and try and take that next step, or any other comment you'd like to make? Robin, you want to start?
Sure. I'll just say that I think it's really ultimately this integrating a material health information and considerations into the design process is really just another level of innovation. It's design innovation. And we all have been trained as architects and interior designers to understand how to sell innovation. It's fundamental to our training. This is just a kind of slightly different focus. And I think that sometimes we think that we don't have to sell this, that this is our decision to make as practitioners. And if a client doesn't like it, then we should just, get ourselves a different client, right? And we should stand on our principles about this stuff and just not engage in the dialogue and just say that, our way or the highway. But I think ultimately you wouldn't do that in designing a building with some other kind of radical idea, a radical form idea, or, other than a materiality idea, a radical approach to daylighting. You wouldn't just kind of say it's my way or the highway. Like, you would have a conversation with the client about why that's a good idea, right? And what the story of the project is that kind of demands they spend their money that way. And this is just an extension of that. But I think as designers, we're less conversant in how to hold the conversations.
I think I'd just like to end by saying that, I think it's a really interesting time to be in the field where these issues are coming up. And I've brought this up before in the past with others about this issue of education and how things have changed, at least even in my own lifetime as an architect. I like to use the example that, when I first started out of college and working, I was using parallel bars and leads and vellum and mylar and things like that. And when CAD first started coming in and becoming part of the profession, people like me were kind of, and definitely people who are a lot older than me who ran the practices were kind of freaked out by this and said, what? This is architecture. This isn't computer science. What is it? Why are, how can this be transforming our industry? But, within a relatively short period of time, within 5 to 10 years of the first, computers and CAD programs getting out there, you found that there was a new generation of people coming out of college who actually were trained in this sort of thing. And all of a sudden it made the transition so easy because you had a whole group of people who just considered this to be part of practice and where practice was going. And so I think for those of us who are kind of, my age, we're still grappling with these things and we're doing our best at it. My hope is that as time goes on, we're going to see that next generation of architects have a base level of knowledge in this area, understand the tools a lot better, understand where the resources are, and really being able to bring this to practice as just part of, typical what's done, because it's going to be their expectation.
I guess I would just say two things. The first being the importance of consistency throughout the construction process and ensuring that if the building owner or developer is in agreement in the goal-setting phase of a project, that schedule, budget, aesthetic, performance are upheld alongside health. So health is always up there with those other kind of more traditional targets throughout the whole project. And that means every meeting that the owner's in. That means every meeting that the owner's not in. And I think it can be really challenging for construction management teams and general contractors, really to no fault of their own, because their job is to uphold schedule and budget. And sometimes these things, if they're not orchestrated well, can fly in the face of those two targets. And so I think it's just really important to keep your eye on the ball the whole way through. And the second is that if designers do nothing else at this point, I think asking for transparent health data is, even if you don't do much to act on it yet. And the reason I say that is I think it's very true that daylight is the best cleanser. And I think that, the more transparency that there is out there, the more manufacturers themselves are going to want to do what the right thing is in their supply chain. Sometimes, in a lot of cases, I think manufacturers don't always even know all the details of what's in their products, and they learn through HPDs too. And so I think just making that ask, even if you don't, you're not using them to make decisions between a lot of products yet, just proliferating that data via that ask is enormous, enormous, enormous. So do that.
I wanted to just build a little bit on John's comment and really speak to the need for us all to be able to create better buildings. And I think that if you're a small firm and you have a very limited budget, you don't have access to outside consultants. And a lot of the work that you do has to come from within your office. And I think there's a kind of, what is the level playing field here? How can we all do a better job at building better, healthier buildings for everyone? And that, for me, is a fundamental tenet of the work that we do. We want equal access to this information. So we advocate for that. We advocate for transparency. And we've also created education. So this amazing 4-course online series of courses that introduce to architects and interior designers a staged approach to learning this material, from a general introduction to the course, to the scientific and technical background to this information, why materials can impact and become part of us, to the last 2 courses, which are really about the practice implications of, once you know this information, how can you transform your practice. So this is, you online people can see this, and we'll show a link to this for everyone else as well. But this is a way for both our current students who enrolled in this, but also practitioners, to really pick up this information now. And I think that there are other organizations who are creating education, but I think this educational programming is actually taught by 60 experts in their field. So it's really been an opportunity for us to gather kind of current knowledge and current thinking in this space, and really, through this programming, empower architects and interior designers to really take on the challenges of this material. So I'm a big advocate for education as a final point.
I just want to say bravo to the people who put the coursework together.
And bravo to our participants.
Catherine, and yeah, seriously, it was just the rigor to how that was put together was very impressive.
So I want to draw the discussion part of our program to close, and I want to thank all of our panelists. And before we leave, Allison is going to just take you through. We're hoping for those both in the audience here as well as on the live stream that this may pique your interest into the next steps. And we want to show you some resources that are available, and then just talk briefly, I think, about the next 2 discussions. If you like this one, and hopefully you did, you'll find the next one's also very thought-provoking. So Allison?
So yes, this is just very quickly. As I mentioned, this is the course material that's available through the Parsons Open Campus site. If you're a friend of the lab, which all of you are friends of the lab, then send us an email and we can sign you up. If you don't want to be a friend to the lab, it costs $50 a course. But that's the link, the healthymaterialslab.org//education. Then our own website has a whole bunch of information. And one of the things that we find particularly important for newcomers to this field is really to kind of ask this question, why healthy materials? So there are some great resources on this page of really explaining kind of fundamentals of why this is an important topic. And then we've developed these tools and guides, thanks to Jack Dinning, who's at the front here, and created this series of introductions to this material, all available online. So why material health research, what's out there at the moment, to look at material design approaches, how can we start to approach this as designers in different kinds of ways, what's the guidance that's out there so that this can help introduce us to how we might start to create those frameworks that would guide our processes, evaluation systems that are out there online. Again, it's all in one place, so it's great to access. What does this mean? Product health reporting. How do you know if a product is healthy? So some simple kind of prompts to help you to begin to understand these issues. And then HPDC has a range of really important resources on their site. Guidelines for if you're interested in obtaining the LEED v4 credit, how you might do that, encouraging people to become members. Please become a member. We're members. We serve on the board. It's a great organization, and it is a member-facing organization. Interrupt me if I'm not including anything, Wendy. And there's CUE courses here to introduce you to why transparency is so incredibly important and fundamental to this work. If we don't know what's inside a product, how can we know whether we should use it or not? So some training courses here for both for designers, for the project team, bringing the team together to understand why this is an important fundamental concept, for manufacturers, and then case studies of projects that have used transparency and material health as fundamental tenets in their work. Other resources that introduce you, the portal that introduce you to the different aspects of HPDs and how you understand them, and the latest version.
Yeah, the most important thing here is that you can go in and ask a question. So if you are starting out in using these transparency documents and you don't understand something, you can create a ticket here. Real people will answer you. And there's also a wealth of knowledge base and FAQs and all kinds of things right on that resource page.
And then the repository has a listing of all of the products that have HPDs registered.
This is where there are 4,100 plus reports. This is available to anyone. It's right on that home page that Allison, the first one, showed you. You just type in a search term. I typed in carpet here, and you'll get all the ones for which that HPDs are available.
And what this is helping us to understand is really to identify manufacturers who are willing to go through this process. So for us, we really encourage all of us to not only request HPDs, but then to look at the manufacturers who are who are participating in this transparency process and supporting them in that effort. That I think is particularly important.
And these are free to download.
And then this is a guide. You want to talk about this?
This is a CU course.
Yeah, to learn more about using HPDs to make better choices.
Yeah, and this gives you, that one gives you a basic background in material health, transparency, covers all the different programs. And it's free.
And it's free. And we have some AIA links also here. Oh, great. Next slide. Yep. 1 minute. Materials matter at the AIA. The AIA, as the professional organization for architects, has been an advocate and a major player in this field, and has started to create materials that are really also very useful for us and helping us guide practice. So Materials Matter is one of those resources. This white paper speaks about the conversation about transparency and risk, and is a useful guideline for those of us who might be concerned about the professional liability risks that could arise in this space. So it's a good guiding document. And then this is a great publication that was just issued this year for the AIA convention, I think, and is worked with the AIA and Arab architects and engineers firms, really about thinking about how we build design practices to support the incorporation of material health. And then, of course, the Committee on the Environment, which is a focus group within the AIA that really speaks to for advocating for environmental issues with the profession. In the profession, and this was this is one of the articles. This is Joe Allen's in the Harvard Gazette, so it's a very easy entree to the beginnings of his research. So it's a great start to understand some of his work and the work of his organization at Harvard. I think that's all. Great. Well, thank you very much for coming. We're having a reception.
Yeah, we're going to have a little reception now for anyone who'd like to just chat. Our next discussion is going to be on October 9th here at Parsons. And look for the announcement. We'll be sending you more information. The topic of that discussion is going to be the data. So we talked a lot about the information here. We've talked about how we might start to introduce it into a practice. This next discussion is going to focus on exactly how some of the practices, beginning with Perkins and Will and others, have gone about doing exactly this. So we invite your participation. We hope you'll come. And then the final one of this series will be on October 30th. And that one will be addressing the topic of beyond transparency, what Robin touched on. What is the story around health? How do we think about using the document beyond having it? And how do we start to really get our hands around what we know, which is just the beginning of how to assess the actual health information itself. So we invite your participation and look forward to seeing you.
Penultimate one.
The penultimate. Oh, and then the.
Then we will be having the fourth in this series.
That's right.
Which we're working on right now, which is really looking at the implications for the affordable housing developers and owners and others, early childhood education facility design and building at that, and looking at new practices that we've revealed in what currently, so and sharing that information.
How can a lot of this be distilled down into a particular application space?
And built.
So that will be our sort of focus test case of a lot of what we're learning here. So again, thanks to our panelists, thanks all of you. Thank you in the live stream. We really appreciate your participation. And join us outside.
We have drinks and something to drink, I think. Yeah. Thank you, guys.